Right. Bernard, you start the panel.
What's that? So I should start also by thanking John, David, and Adrian. And I should also start immediately by saying the usual disclaimer applies. So what I'm saying is not the ECB's view, but my own. And I try to put the flow funds perspective. The panel is about new data needs, what kind of data we need. And I try to argue that maybe the flow funds is a sort of a middle ground between modeling one representative agent like pre-crisis or modeling 20 million in terms of agent-based modeling. So to get some structure in there. I will start by a quote that Alan Kerman has quoted before, that is Trichet during the crisis. So there is a desperation by policymakers during the crisis who did say that at that time they felt abandoned by what they had as conventional tools in their normal toolbox. And the way I would like to think about that is actually like Paul Tucker talked about it yesterday. What is a model? It's a way to organize a conversation. And the type of models we had available, macro models, probably did not allow the kind of conversation we need to have in a crisis. So I'm going to follow up on that by saying, of course, data and thinking is closely connected. Goes back to Keynes and how macro started. And the flow funds allows you to look at the kind of issues that did come up during the crisis. So it's a balance of payments crisis in the euro area, a sectoral savings investment balance crisis. It's a leverage crisis, balance sheets matter, flows and balance sheets, and there's interconnectedness between the real and financial sectors. So new out thinking in a way. We've had a bit of examples, say, of the kind of, I would say, people or economists who looked at things before the crisis, which then, were vindicated to some extent, which is the BIS view of financial balances. I think Shin has actually written on the leverage targeting in 2006 of the broker-dealer sector, so the investment banks. And he looked at flow funds data, just sort of bottom up. What does the data tell us? So that's a bit in the spirit we had before. The more inductive way. John Wilbauer has, of course, given some example of, I think, what in another paper we called the elephant in the room, which is financialization, which was behind the consumption boom. But one word which was not coming out in Wendy's talk, or most people's talk, is money. And of course, from the ECB, I will have to come at least say there is a role also to bring money back into what I think in Mike Woodford's textbook is only a footnote, in the textbook on monetary policy and monetary theory, which I think we went overboard there as a profession. So let me not spend that much time here, but this has been covered in deduction and economic history, and a lot of what we discussed yesterday, I mean, reminds me of Hayek, of Schumpeter. I mean, there's a rich history in economics thinking that we could sort of go back to and revive. Now, this is about data gaps. When I went to Trichet with my flow funds, of course he wants to know the latest data in the crisis, what's happening blow by blow. But we not just need data on these new financial animals in the zoo, which is special purpose vehicles and conduits and that kind of stuff. But we also need a map to make sense, a macro map. I think there with the flow funds is quite useful to have a macro map of all the forest. And to know what you don't know, to identify the gaps. Okay, that's the kind of map. Conduits are here, 7 sectors. That gives you a picture. Private sector assets, liabilities, intermediation, banks, non-banks, shadow banks. And that's kind of data bank. I think we come back to that. Liz will talk about the sort of macro-prudential side, and I talk here about the traditional macro side, if you will. But these initiatives actually were all on track or on train, most of them, before the financial crisis. We had regulations under preparation for securitization vehicles, but they just came on stream when they had already exploded in our faces. So I think there is a certain implementation lag in this data collection process. Let me just give you a sort of a flavor of some pictures from the flow funds, which do help make interconnections, sectors here. I think Wendy mentioned the paradox of thrift. Now, if all sectors are saving, that's in the crisis here. The corporate sector was saving. In the UK, it's still saving now, more than investing, in the US as well. So that's the kind of thing where you have to wonder about what's happening here. They're no longer the traditional deficit sector. Of course, the government steps in as the dissaver of last resort if all the sectors are saving. So that kind of, I think, pedagogically for students, that was in the textbooks. Charles, I think your own textbook, 1980s, Mike Arce's textbook, that used to be a part of the textbooks, and that's no longer in all the textbooks, that sector perspective. So flows, here is the new area, surplus and deficit countries, so you get the scale of imbalances within the euro area, so more of the country. These are two groups of countries, and you see what happened there. It's just the private deficit in the sort of southern countries, swinging into radical surplus, which is the more traditional configuration there. So, flows, that's the flow perspective, and then you have the stock perspective, balance sheets, leverage. Here's debt to income ratios. So, how to look at the balance sheet? Debt to income, debt service capacity, or debt to assets. That's the more natural flow of funds where debt to assets. That's the next picture. But immediately here you see, fiscal sector taking the slack in the US, the debt going up, the red line, which corresponds to deleveraging. Household sector. No, that's the household sector. That's the banking sector. So you get a picture of how the sectors relate together. Household sector and banking sector deleveraging, the government sector leveraging up, if you want, in this debt to income perspective. Final example: leverage as debt to assets. This is what is the headline debt to assets of the whole euro area, so all sectors together. In the good times, that leverage, that measured headline leverage, actually went down. Whereas if you take out the price effects from the booming asset markets, what we call the notional leverage, let's change the notional leverage, that went up. So I think we need to look through the valuation effects to actually look at the underlying leverage dynamics. You see, of course, the deleveraging here in the wake of the crisis. And what you also see, this is non-consolidated data. Again, monetary analysis typically looks at consolidated balance sheet of banks. But a lot of this, as we discussed yesterday, is intra-financial sector building up leverage. All the yellow bars here. It's not like the small leverage boom in corporate leverage here. It's a different cycle than the 2000 equity boom bust cycle. So I should come to a close. This is illustrating how two sectors deleverage, rebuilding savings, stocks and flows together. That's flow funds. Or they have to liquidate debt, selling assets. That's the asset fire sale dynamics, and that's the core of why are central banks stepping in, because they want to prevent that destructive deleverage asset disposal by other sectors. But you have to keep all the sectors in the picture to understand what's going on. So I close on this macroprudential, which is then going over to you. So there are ways to embed, this is coming from the ECB, money demand in the broader asset universe. That's what we're trying to do. Just empirical, I should say, stylized facts. Sorry about stylized facts, but you need to establish how do these financial variables interact with the real variables, so VRs, or getting some empirical evidence of that. Try to get that at the ECB as well, and we do now look more at the country dimension, country data. Projections, cross-checking, I do not apologize for the ECB having two pillars. I think in the end, if there's too much consensus, so I would agree with Wendy a little bit on that. I think maybe it's good to have more than one view of the world on the table for the 27 governors on the ECB Council or for the NPC members. That's having a conversation can mean all agreeing, but also means expressing disagreement in a coherent way. And that may be needed, especially in crisis times. They're very different with the world. So I stop there, and macro-financial risk, that is macro-prudential. We can use the flow funds also to look at cross-sector exposures. This is network analysis. And on the data side, what we need to do now more is on the whom-to-whom information. Which sector holds which securities. That's the next project for the next 1-2 years, getting that whom-to-whom information into our flow fund system. Final thing is micro-macro. just a nice handover for you as well. I liked a lot, with interest I read the event of England submission, this Treasury Select Committee on the distribution effects of QE and low interest rates. That's a dimension you can only get if you then match, say, the microdata, as you did in that submission, with the flow funds data. Which sectors are benefiting, who's not benefiting from low interest rates, from asset purchases and so forth. I think that discussion will come up now. Distribution is back on the agenda, and again, from the micro and macro side, that's important to look into. Thank you very much.
Bernard, thank you very much. You know you need 3 pillars to be stable.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Let me get out of this and find what I've loaded up onto this toy. I should provide again the standard disclaimer. These are my own views, and the work I'm going to talk about is work that I did at the National Institute, which is a reason for the joint affiliation. What I want to talk about is something rather different, the role of qualitative data as a high-frequency, timely source of information on the state of the economy. Whether high-frequency enough to meet David's needs, I don't know, but my sense as a policy maker is that trying to work out where you are at the moment is a not inconsiderable problem. And no, we have really 2 types of surveys that are supposed to help us. There are business surveys. Of course, Joe has pointed out that the ONS does surveys. That's how it's collects its information. Nevertheless, by business surveys, I mean the qualitative surveys that are done in Britain by non-government bodies, although you find in some countries, such as the Netherlands, they're done by government bodies, by government statistics offices. Business surveys are thought to provide a timely indicator of the state of the economy. My own sense is that they're often invested with magical properties, in that people seem to attribute an accuracy to them that they're thinking about where they come from and so on. You probably wouldn't actually believe that you could actually invest in them. Typically people rely on balanced statistics, the proportion of optimists less the proportion of pessimists, in response to some question as an indicator of where GDP is or where it's going to be, and they do that through statistical relationships which are reminiscent of the early what I describe as the early days of econometrics, i.e. relying on the sorts of relationships when you look at them, you would expect them to break down, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I think quite separately, although it's not necessarily the fault of the users or some of the producers of the data, but some commentators don't understand the difference between these qualitative data and real quantitative data. As far as consumer surveys go, these have typically, in Britain and in the United States and on the continent, developed an arbitrary aggregate relying on arbitrary weightings of a number of questions to produce an area called consumer confidence, and at least in some, from some people, this leads to an extraordinary belief that confidence is the main determinant of consumption. One of the jobs that MPC members do from time to time is judge a competition of school children. How would they get on at coming to views about economic policy, and I have sometimes had to ask how, if confidence is the main determinant of consumption, people are expected to pay for what it is that they're buying. But anyway, the evidence in the UK is that this measure of consumer confidence has little explanatory power in a traditional consumption function. In the United States, it seems to be more informative. On the other hand, there is some evidence that the measures are better indicators than the first ONS estimates of real personal disposable income as indicators of consumption. Well, if that's an unhelpful, or at least an account, a slightly jaundiced account of the way I see the data, what do I think should be done? I think the most important thing is that consumer services and business surveys should be run as panels. That we have typically learned that you can gain an awful lot of information from studying panels. Longitudinal micro data sets and what people like working with, where they can work with them, and with business surveys, if they could be linked into the interdepartmental business register so that users could then connect them to government data. You could then address questions like how the answers to them relate to the various surveys that Joe and his colleagues carry out. The monthly production inquiry, well, I did a study like that using the CBI data, and analogous sources nowadays for construction and services. In particular, the official construction statistics have been fairly volatile. It would be interesting to know what answers firms are giving to Joe and what answers they're giving to the qualitative surveys, which have sometimes suggested a rather different pattern. Because without that, I simply don't feel I know how to interpret the difference. What sort of things might you want to know about the relationship between what the firms say in qualitative and quantitative data? What colleagues and I found in the CBI survey on manufacturing was that the answers are related, but what firms say in qualitative data is affected by what we call collective sentiment, as well as what is actually happening to that firm, at least if you measure what's happening to that firm by the answers that people give to the ONS. It would be helpful to know whether that's also true in construction at the moment. What about alternatives to the balance statistic? Well, if some firms are more informative than other firms, then typically you would want to give more weight to the firms that are informative than to the firms that are uninformative, and that's almost certainly the case. In the Netherlands, after I suggested that there were merits in looking at the panel, they found that 15% of firms always gave the same answer. Having discovered this, approached them and asked them why they gave the same answer. Well, whether that enhanced the quality of the data significantly, I don't know, but it's something that can't be done in the United Kingdom because these data are provided in the private sector, and I think probably using the same sort of techniques as were in use 50 years ago. Are changes of opinion important? It may well be that you need not only to know about the balance, but also know about the people who were optimists who've become pessimists, the people who were pessimists who've become optimists. Again, you can only look at those if you treat the data as balances, but we don't really know. Can surveys help with other aspects of consumer behaviour? Well, almost certainly, but ideally, of course, if you knew who were answering, you could relate what the individual consumers say to the sorts of answers that they've given in tax returns and so on. We are getting closer to doing that with official data, and it would help us validate these sorts of data. With consumer surveys, 0 minute, well, what I would say is I think we have no experience of high-frequency panels. An internet survey could be run on a monthly basis very cheaply. Would it work? I don't know, but it's probably an experiment that's worth trying. Thank you very much. There are some conclusions.
Thank you, Martin. And now we have the view from across the Atlantic. Or aim across the Atlantic.
Yes, sometimes technology works very well. So I'm going to talk from not only a view from across the Atlantic, but emphasizing somewhat different issues from what have come up in the previous talks. I'm going to focus on some dynamic issues involving the interaction between data methods and analysis and standard disclosure of fives. So my comments will focus some on the sort of tapestry involved with data issues, not the particular thread. So I'm not going to be talking about some of the individual data series that we might want to add to what we're currently gathering. And to talk about the tapestry, we need to talk about some of the uses of economic statistics. We clearly want to understand the economy, and that's really about inference. We want to anticipate what the economy is going to do. That's about forecasting. And we may want to influence the economy. That's about policy. And the empirical economic analysis is necessarily going to go in tandem with the theories that we're bringing to it and the implied data that we need to examine those theories empirically. And there are a number of different sorts of things that we can think about doing. One is obviously to anticipate problems before they occur. Those are sorts of earlier advanced warning devices. Another is detecting problems as soon or soon after they occur. Third is rapid adjustment to or correction of problems once they've arisen. And the fourth would be avoiding the same or similar problems in the future, learning from the past. And that in particular may involve gathering new statistics based on the analysis we've done. An excellent paper by Eichner, Cohen, and Palumbo, colleagues, or in the case of Don Cohen, former colleague of mine at the So, of course, there's an example of the sorts of things that we're worried about. And quite importantly, as David mentioned, this is September 15th. This is actually to the day, a year before Lehman Brothers collapses. Another example of the sorts of things that we're concerned about in this. We'd like to anticipate it. We'd certainly like to know when it's going on, and we'd certainly like to learn what we ought to be doing in the future. Another example, Christina Romer going at the beginning of 2009 and presenting alternatives to the new administration and realizing something needs to be done, and then having, after the fact, very, very substantial systematic forecast errors present. Those are the sorts of things we'd like to avoid. So, an example of the sorts of detection we might want to be involved in, we'd look at modeled versus, say, unmodeled imbalances. Modeled imbalances include all of the sorts of ways we've done that in the different models that have been described here. Unmodeled ones are ones that we didn't model. And as David's mentioned, there's been recent literature on detecting those through the use of impulse indicator saturation. And just as an example, let's consider leading up to the recent stock market crash in 2008. So say we're applying this technique to stock market data and trying to find out if it's going to happen, when it happens, and learning from it afterwards. And just as a very simple example.
Down below Neil.
Sorry?
Yes. Somehow you've got it down below, yeah.
It's already set up.
I know, but it's hidden.
Let's see that. Now I have it, thank you. So this is a very simple model of the change in equity prices, more general than what comes out of a lot of theories. It's actually an AR1, but in the changes. And we want to find out if there have been any anomalies, any structural breaks, any really unexplained disequilibrium that are present. We're, say, sitting in the third quarter. We go and apply impulse indicator saturation. I'm going to use extremely tight target values, 0.1%. We've got roughly 100 observations here. So very unlikely to pick up anything unless it matters, unless it really belongs there. So 2008, quarter 3, we go and apply it. We've now gone and done all of those block searches that David talked about. Of course, it does pick up October 1987, first major challenge to Greenspan. Now we go one more period and conduct the same sort of thing and looking at what happens then. And just to be a little fair, let's get rid of the previous impulse that we picked up and see if it really did matter or if it was an anomaly once we go and include an additional observation. And so we go and do that, apply it, and boom. We found that something's now happened. And we're talking major, major events, 33% drop in the stock market. So at least this is an indication of how we might do detection of events as they're occurring. And so that's going to be quite useful to us. We'd like to anticipate them or find them out more rapidly, and that argues for much higher frequency data. But we could see setting up these sorts of methods as early warning or early detection devices. And they really are in contrast with a lot of the previous technology for looking for changes, such as Andrews and Viper own, which are wonderful techniques. But we have to wait 5 years to know that we have a financial crisis. And as a policymaker, we don't want to do that. And it can obviously be generalized, multivariate systems. We can look not only at impulses, but things that might capture the sort of more slowly evolving features of the data, like step functions, which are just partial sums of impulses, or broken trends, which might be the sort of thing that would capture the buildup in liquidity that then led to the crisis. And these can include as much economic theory into those systems as we have available, and yet not force the theory to be the sole explanatory. So, some of the features, talked about that and others, and switching sort of hats here, I'd like to give an example of how we might be able to provide this sort of data to a wide audience. And the example concerns FRED, which is the Federal Reserve Economic Data run by the St. Louis Fed, which began in 1961 by the research director circulating a memo with 3 monetary aggregates on it and saying, if this is useful, please let me know and I'll circulate it again. It then led to many additional series, going electronic, going on the web, becoming a real database. Currently, it's providing 61,000 series based on 46 national, international, public, and private sources, such as the Federal Reserve Board, Bureau of Economic Analysis, BLS, Dow Jones, Standard & Poor's, NBER, a variety of central banks, OECD, IMF, on and on and on. The availability is timely, often within an hour of when the source of the data releases it. Now, the St. Louis Fed isn't providing directly the data much themselves. They're just serving as a consolidator, if you wish, or a coordinator, because then it makes it quite easy through them to access data that might otherwise be very inaccessible. And lots of benefits that can arise from this: accountability, information distribution. Poole talked about that some in an excellent article a few years ago. Centralized collection, and what effectively Kevin Hoover referred to at one point, single-stop data shopping. So you don't have to be searching among all these different agencies. All the agencies put it there. And very, very strong positive externalities, policymakers to academics, because so many people will go there, and even non-US academics or policymakers will go to analyze this data because it is convenient, it is documented, and so they use it. So I think the US has actually benefited enormously from non-US analysts looking at this. Another relatively recent innovation they've done is to start providing vintage information. So they've got snapshots. They know when every single data series has been revised. And so you can look at what information was available, say, to policymakers at a given time, rather than using the after-the-fact revised data. So just to go back quite a while, the National Research Council in the US had recommended that funding organizations should encourage data sharing, and that organizations funding large-scale general-purpose data sets should very much consider data archives in addition to the data themselves. Now, there's lots of ways in which you might do that, through grant incentive structure, enforcement, so you've got both the carrot and the stick. So for the ESRC in particular, there's a number of options available in light of this. One is that a UK FRED is set up, and the ESRC can benefit from all the mistakes that FRED has made and not do them. Or you could simply piggyback on FRED itself, just providing the data, and they'll put it up. And they've been very, very active, almost aggressive, in trying to get other agencies to put the data there. And this would apply to other UK government agencies. So Many thanks.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to John, the organizer. You have 2 hours, John.
5 minutes. Right, well, the present state of UK macro data, this is my first point. I have 2 points to make. This is my first. I think we face the largest degree of data uncertainty in my professional life. I think Gordon Brown's decision to relocate the Office of National Statistics to Newport, South Wales, against Bank of England advice.
No, it wasn't.
Sorry?
No, it wasn't.
Okay. Well, led to a loss of institutional memory in some of the most experienced people, 80% or something of the national accounts stock left, I believe. The website is still very poor. If you look for the topic of mortgage interest rate, I challenge you to find the time series. Even before relocation, there was little interest in the upkeep of long historical series of at least approximate consistency. Just to 2 examples, the mortgage interest rate is another one. They used to publish data, you can find it in the Nuffield Library, in the stacks, but it's not available electronically joined up with anything more recent. Take PPI, producer price indices. BLS produces 900 series of different levels of disaggregation. There's no such historical record produced in the UK. Neil mentioned Fred. I think Fred is absolutely marvellous. And as he said, it's created a huge positive externality for the US because researchers all over the world, if you go to the ECB, I mean, half of the people there are working on the US data rather than Eurozone data because it's so easily available, it's consistent, it goes back a long way, and so on. Working on UK data is still an uphill struggle. And yet, the signal-to-noise ratio is great. The UK is a small open economy, subject to large shocks, many of them external in origin. So the problems of endogeneity and multicollinearity that often exist in US data shouldn't arise in the UK. So the UK should be very desirable as a place to do empirical research. But instead, of course, funding cuts and cuts in surveys are actually making this worse. My second point is to provide some insights from my own research into data needs. Bernard made some very good points about flow of funds data. The US, of course, leads in that. UK household flow of funds data go back to 63. The quality is not quite as good as it might be, but it's not bad. Many countries lack such data and haven't been aware, in fact, they could produce such data. They haven't bothered to join up the estimates that do exist. One of the things that's often missing is household sector ownership of housing market. So measuring housing equity withdrawal is something that's very difficult on a comparative country basis. Of course, there's very poor quality or missing data on mixed-adjusted house price indices internationally. I mean, we can have data of some countries. The OECD puts together a bunch of series, but comparability in the quality is extremely variable. Measurement of the mortgage stock by type, also by type and origin, is internationally very patchy, so it's very hard to do international comparisons, and particularly comparisons over time of the evolutions of mortgage stocks. For some countries we have these data, but many countries we don't. And mortgage characteristics like loan to value, loan to income, debt maturity, and so on, which one would need to track country differences in financial innovation. These data are usually actually missing. The UK is one of the few countries that has some reasonable data of that sort. And then missing survey data. The dominance of what I call know-it-all macro, without credit frictions, contributed to the lack of interest in survey data on bank lending, so that's the credit frictions bit, and house price expectations. House price expectations are key to the dynamics of the housing market, and of course that's been very important in the subprime crisis and the problems of Spain and Ireland and so on. On the first, I mentioned the senior loan officers from the Fed. It's been tracking changes in the tightness of bank credit since '66. The ECB began a similar survey in 2002 to despite Bundesbank skepticism. Bank of England, which of course never believed that credit mattered, only began in 2007. Our guest last night told me that back in '97 he tried to persuade the bank to follow the Fed's lead. And I myself tried to persuade Irving King, I think about '99, that Bank of England really should survey bank lending. Now, expectations of house and land prices play a critical role in these dynamics. Overvaluation of house prices basically arise for two reasons. One is extrapolated expectations after recent rises, and the other one is fragile fundamentals. User cost is the key element that drives house prices. That's where expectations and interest rates really matter. Extrapolated expectations amplify and propagate shocks. So here's some work from the US based on a paper with John Duca and Anthony Murphy. What we've done here is take the long-run solution of our house price equation. By the way, in December 2009, we forecast that in 2012, the US housing market would start to recover. So almost 3 years ago, and I think we were right. Anyway, with this model, we can contrast what the contribution, what the user cost actually made to explaining house prices, that's the red line, and what it would have made if simply the historical long-run average of appreciation had been used instead of recent appreciation, previous 4 years appreciation. And that difference, which is about 30% or something like that, is an estimate of the contribution that extrapolated expectations made to the overshooting of US house prices. Now, if we had decent survey data that tracked these expectations, we would have been in a much better position to say this is a bubble, we really need to take policy decisions. What data exist? Well, the ONS actually surveyed house price expectations briefly in 1996, 96 to 9 in the Omnibus survey, and the British Social Attitudes survey had some questions in particular years, but really these surveys should have been regular and still should be regular. There's a new NBR paper by Case, Schuler and Thompson, which tracks data from 2003 on just based on 4 cities, their own survey, which is very much consistent with this view that people extrapolate expectations into the future and track this very serious shift in expectations that took place in the US from about 2006 onwards. That's it.
Thank you very much, John. Jay Rice will now act as a discussant.
There's really 3 points I wanted to make coming out of the conference. The one is a no-brainer, but it's actually, I think, sufficiently important just to underline it. That is, we've talked repeatedly over the last day and a half about the importance of flow of funds, financial data, and actually flow of funds, I think, including integrated balance sheets. Those are available and are of high quality in the United States. In Europe, there are well-developed plans, I think, to produce something of a comparable standard. In the UK, John Wilbur is quite right to say that we have in principle this information dating back to 1983, at least in terms of flow of funds. 63, I'm sorry, 63. The truth of the matter is that that data is not in a good state, and increasingly over time it has become less and less fit for purpose. For a country with a financial sector the size of the UK and the major financial sectors of the world, it seems to me to be little short really of national standard. This is not only detrimental to policy, but also, I think, very germane to the agenda and macroeconomics that we talked about over the last day and a half. 2 other points I wanted to make, slightly separate. The one is, we've talked quite a bit about the fact that we are now in a world where information is not at a premium, it is actually coming out of our ears. We have massive sources of information, The question is how to make use of that in a way which is useful and reliable. Partly that is a question of exploiting not only the wealth of information available through the internet in its various forms, but also increasingly commercial databases really want to know about what is happening to prices in the UK, and you can certainly have a pretty good start by asking Tesco what's happening on their databases. If you want to know about financial transactions, know about associated real transactions, then a pretty good contribution comes from asking Barclaycard, Visa, credit card providers what is going on. And actually they do have this information in a way which is reliable and can be used. But actually needs to be turned into something which is useful for research and for policy purposes. Two subsets of that, I think. First of all, Martin talked about various business surveys, non-official business surveys. They range from being potentially extremely useful to being little more than pieces of seaweed. And actually, the important point is to discriminate between them. Again, as a way of getting at high-frequency data and the various indications we've had about that, then exploiting this information available in the world as we know how it's important. The lesson I draw from that is that there is an agenda to get together an agreed way, a consensus way, best practice way of exploiting all this vast amount of information available to us into something which is useful for research and policy purposes. And that goes well beyond traditional surveys, official surveys, that is, and administrative sources. Lots of information to be used here and exploited. But exploited in a way which is useful rather than just badly used information, badly assembled. Final point, again, sort of surfaced a couple of times, but not quite as clearly as I would want it to. There's a kind of background narrative to this session that the macroeconomy was going quite well, macroeconomic policy, macroeconomic theory was in good shape until we got to the financial crisis, and then we realised how wrong we were. Now, at the back of my mind is the fact that we had a couple of years ago the Stiglitz-Sen Fitoussi Commission, and actually going with that, the information produced in the United States a couple of weeks ago, which suggests that for a median American, living standards are no better now than they were in 1996. So we don't have those figures in the UK. We will have them next year, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it doesn't tell a similar story. So it seems to me that it's not necessarily the case that the average member of our societies would regard the last 15 years as being such a big success story as we might otherwise imagine. One thing that comes out of that, which did surface a couple of times, is that we might want to be clearer about what is the distribution of these big aggregates that we're talking about, not just the aggregate themselves. So it may well be that consumption is high in aggregate, but is that going to the few, or is it going to many, or what is happening over time? And it seems to me that there are ways we can do that, which we should do, again, possibly drawing on some of these large sources of information now available to us. But it seems to me that both our theory and our data should look much more at those distributional issues as well as the aggregate effects. And I think that's me done.
Right. And thank you very much. Most of the time for discussion was taken up by setting up the PowerPoints. But we have got time just for anyone who's bursting to raise a comment. A couple. Nope. 2 minutes.
Yeah, I absolutely agree on the distributional argument. I think in addition to sort of knowing the welfare implications, I also think some of the systemic properties that people have talked about in terms of how heterogeneity contributes to stability and contributes to instability are worth considering. So I think there's multiple reasons why you want to think of distribution.
David, did we? Sorry.
Just briefly related to that, I think there needs to be an effort to unlock a lot of the, particularly panel and survey microdata that's around, that's producing these aggregates, but researchers often don't have access to the microdata where you can get at these distributional issues. There's been some progress on standardizing that in the US, because there's obviously confidentiality concerns, but in other countries, like the UK, it's much harder to get access to that data.
Join.
Well, I had essentially the same point. I mean, I have a long list of things like that where I'm struggling to get the data. I spend a lot of my time trying to track data sets down. And like this morning, I mentioned, you know, a model of overlapping portfolios and banks. We can calibrate that model, but we really need detailed, you know, balance sheets of what banks have on their books to do that. And so, a long wish list. And I think it's, if we're going to give these techniques like agent-based modeling a chance, we really have to get at that kind of data, because aggregate data just doesn't have what we need.
Please.
Concerning the banking system, there is something that I do not understand at all. Although I'm a central banker, what I see is that since supervision is supposed to go to central banks, which is a new development, apparently because central banks and monetary policy would create good reasons to foster collaboration with between monetary policy and financial stability. I observed that there is more and more impossibility of sharing data within the central banks which are mentioned. I'm wondering what is the rationale for this?
I thought in the ECB that you would know that sort of thing. Right.
It's a comment on the problem of having so much US data and also the way the economics profession works. John Mulbauer brought up the issue of the loan-to-value, loan-to-income data that we may or may not have. In the US, there is both loan-to-value and loan-to-income, loan-to-income, loan-to-value ratio of the data for housing markets, mortgage markets. And we know that in the US, there's some evidence that the loan-to-value ratio causes house prices statistically. Therefore, you see lots and lots of economists saying we must control the loan-to-value ratio, and that will control house prices. Now, there's two problems with that. First of all, there's only one other country where there's the data available on a consistent basis to do the same test. That's the UK. And in the UK, the loan-to-value ratio doesn't cause house prices, it's the loan-to-income ratio. So if we all become convinced from just the US data that this is the right thing to do, and the only other bit of data we've got suggests it isn't, that's going to be a great shame, because once again, theory tells us what the correct policy is. There's no evidence to support it. In 10 years' time, we've found we've made a mistake. So if somebody could dig all that data out for all the European countries over the last 30 years, it'd be very useful.
Well, I've got to catch a train, so I'm going to... I thank the panel very, very much indeed. And we ought to hand over, I think, to... is it David? It's to David to
Yes.
So, thank you, Charles, for doing that. Quarter of zero, let me make some thank you remarks. Obviously, the people we have to thank most are the ESRC. They have funded, organised, asked for and arranged to have this, and we're very grateful for their support. However, they did land the job on John and myself to actually do it. Unfortunately, I was ill for most of the year, and 95% of what you have seen intellectually and in terms of making sure speakers, etc., turned up is due to John, and I'd very much like to thank John for all his wonderful work in getting this done. And even more so that he has got to produce an eight-page report for the ESRC to feed into their future funding plans, because this conference is about giving them information for future funding. So thanks very much, John. We thanked Angela, who did all the local organisation, etc., around the conference, making sure you were fed, bed, and gear. And the Oxford Martin School for providing the accommodation. And then, of course, I would like to thank you all for coming. It's been very stimulating. I'm not sure how much we can actually help the ESRC with our report. There's a wide range of views, and maybe that's one of the most important aspects to feed into the future, that don't put all your eggs in one basket. Portfolio theory says that you need a wide range of views, we need lots of discussion within the profession. We need it perhaps to be a bit more open and a bit less silo-based than has been the case. And subject to that, thank you very much, and thank you for coming.
Someone should thank David.